Lectures on the Basics of Biblical Greek, Chapter 19. In our previous lesson, we introduced the passive voice, where the action is done by an instrument or by a person on the subject of the sentence. We learned a new set of personal endings, the primary middle passive endings, which are used to form the present passive indicative. We talked about deponent verbs, verbs that are passive in form but active in meaning. We did a bit on the present middle indicative, although all such forms that we have right now are actually deponent. And we looked at how the forms work with contract verbs and a couple of minor issues that show up with them. To date, we've learned two sets of personal endings: the primary active endings, used in the present active indicative, and the primary middle passive endings, which are used on the present middle passive and deponent forms. In this chart, one can see the three components of the present active indicative: the present stem, connecting vowel, omicron or epsilon, and then the personal endings. The same holds true of the present middle passive indicative forms: present stem plus connecting vowel, omicron or epsilon, plus the primary middle passive endings: mai, sai, tai, methes, the, and ntai. In this lesson, we're going to add a second tense. In addition to changing the person, number, and voice, we're now going to start changing the tense as well. To do that, first of all, we're going to talk a bit about Greek tenses and what are called principal parts. Then we'll look more specifically at the future tense, how it is formed, and learn the first and major pattern of that formation. We'll look briefly at the future middle and the future of the verb eimi. First of all, a word about Greek tenses. There are 5 major tenses in Koine Greek: present, imperfect, future, aorist, and perfect. The present tense we've already learned. The future tense is our focus for this lesson. There are actually 2 other Greek tenses, the pluperfect and the future perfect, but the usage of these has so dropped off by the Koine period that it's not worth spending the time to learn the forms. When they rarely occur, one simply looks them up. From those 5 tenses, there are 7 combinations that we will learn this semester and next: the present, the imperfect, the future active, the aorist active, the perfect passive, and the aorist passive. Again, you've learned the present. You're going to learn this lesson the future active. Since the imperfect is formed on the present, Greek identifies 6 principal parts of the verb. Sometimes those parts are quite regular, sometimes they seem to be irregular, on the basis of which we build all the verbal combinations. Those principal parts are the present, future active, aorist active, perfect middle, sometimes called the perfect passive, and the aorist passive. If, for example, a student looks up the word Leo in a word list or a lexicon, a Greek dictionary, the student will discover that in addition to the basic form and meaning, there are 6 principal parts: Leo, Liso, Elisa, Lelika, Lelimai, and Elithane. Those principal parts are in order: the present, future active, aorist active, perfect middle, and aorist passive. Unfortunately, not all words exist in all forms, so a lexicon will frequently simply put a hyphen for forms that don't occur, such as with the verb dokeo, which exists only in the present and the aorist active. Within each of these principal parts, the most basic form, that is the form once one removes augments and formatives and personal endings, is the tense stem. Leo is used as a paradigm because its tense stem is the same in all of its principal parts. Would that other verbs worked that way? The reality is they don't. There's quite a bit of seeming change. But even within those changes, there are patterns which emerge that preclude one having to memorize a whole lot of forms. We turn now to the future tense of the Greek verb. In Greek, the future has the same meaning as English. So once we know how to form these verbal parts, translating them is not difficult. Let's start with the future active. The future active consists not of 3 parts put together, but of 4 parts put together. The future active stem, which comes from the second principal part, a tense formative, sigma, the connecting vowel that we already know, omicron and epsilon, plus the primary active endings. These 4 pieces go together to make the future active form. Essentially, the only difference between the future active and the present active is the presence of the sigma. We'll use the same chart of personal endings to form the future active. We'll use the primary active endings. And now let's look at the first major pattern that's used to form the future active. That pattern consists of the future stem, a tense formative, sigma, connecting vowel, omicron or epsilon, applied as previously, omicron before mu and nu, epsilon in other cases, and omicron or epsilon when there isn't a personal ending. And so the forms go together to look just like the present indicative with this pattern, except for the presence of the sigma. See the blue sigma in the completed forms. Liso, I shall destroy. Lyses, you will destroy, you singular, and so forth. Contract verbs follow the same pattern of forming the future. Future stem, tense formative, connecting vowel, and ending. But with contract verbs, because the stem ends in a short vowel, that vowel lengthens before the sigma. So the alpha in agapa lengthens to an eta, and the form is agapeso. Alphas lengthen to etas, epsilons lengthen to etas, and omicrons lengthen to omegas. It's the same pattern. The only difference is that the stem vowel lengthens. Also within this pattern are those stems that end in a stop, such as blepo. The stem ends in a labial, P. When it's combined with the sigma, according to the square of stops we learned several lessons ago, the result is a psi. So the future of blepo is blepso. One can still see the sigma, it's just in combination with the stop. So a labial stop plus a sigma gives psi, a velar plus a sigma gives xi, and a dental plus sigma, the dental drops out and only the sigma remains. These are the three examples of the first and major pattern for forming the future active indicative. Let's now do some translating, because no matter which of these sub-patterns is followed, translation is always the same for the future. Liso, I shall destroy. Agapeses, you singular will love. Blepse, he, she, or it will see. Blepsemen, we shall see. Agapesete, you plural will love. Lisusi, they will destroy. Having talked about the future tense and the first major pattern for forming the future, we now turn to the future middle. As one would expect, the future middle is formed similarly using the future active stem, the tense formative, connecting vowel, and a primary middle passive ending. Notice, though, this is just the formation of the future middle. The future passive will come up in our lessons later because it's formed on a different stem. It uses the aorist passive stem to form the future passive. So we're just now talking about the future middle. And since all of the middles that we know so far are deponent, we're actually getting forms with middle endings but active meanings. Again, the difference between the future active and the future middle is the use of the primary middle passive endings. So, taking the deponent verb por euomai, the future stem is por you, the tense formative is a sigma, the connecting vowel is an omicron, and the first person singular primary middle passive ending is my, so the form is por eusamai. Second person singular, por euse, por eusatai, third singular, por eusamatha, first plural, por eusiste, second plural, por eusamontai is the third person plural. These are middle in form, but active in meaning because the verb is deponent. Now, most verbs that are deponent in the present are also deponent in the future, but not always. And that's another reason why principal parts become so important, because they reveal when a particular tense is regular or deponent. If it's deponent in that principal part, the tense is deponent. If it's not, it's not. So, for example, gnosko, the word to know, in the future is gnosemai. It's deponent in the future, but not in the present or the aorist. Lastly, we want to note the formation of the future of a me. Unlike the present of a me, the future is quite regular and easy to identify. The future of a me is a middle indicative form, but it's active in meaning, if a stative verb can be active. It consists of an epsilon plus the tense formative, sigma, plus the connecting vowel, omicron or epsilon, plus a primary middle passive ending. And so, esomai is translated, I shall be. Esse, you singular, will be. Estai, she, he, it will be. Esamatha, we shall be. Eseste, you plural, will be. Esontai, they will be. Notice, again, how regular this form is. It's a future middle in form, but we parse it as deponent and translate it actively. So in this lesson, we've looked at the Greek tenses, there are 5, and the principal parts, there are 6. We're now starting to vary the tense, so we learned a new tense, the future tense, which translates just like the future does in English. And we learned the first pattern for forming those futures, adding a sigma as a tense formative to the future stem. When that future stem is a contract verb, the contract vowel lengthens. And when that future stem ends in a stop, the sigma combines with the stop according to the square of stops, but it's still the same basic pattern. Future stem, sigma, omicron, epsilon, primary ending. We also looked at the future middles, which are formed similarly, except they use the middle passive ending, but they are not passive. In fact, most of them that we have are deponent. And we also talked about the future of Amy.